You're watching American Stars, home of emotional, powerful celebrity stories. Please like, subscribe, and stay with us. In the very last stretch of Ozzy Osbourne's long and complicated journey, when most people had already stopped paying attention to the quiet details of his daily life, something surprisingly simple, yet deeply emotional, happened. It wasn't a concert, it wasn't an interview, and it wasn't anything the public ever expected from the Prince of Darkness. It was a small conversation, a slow, quiet, almost whispered moment between him and Sharon, one that didn't involve fame, lights, or chaos. It involved only one thing, a final wish, a wish that, once said, changed everything for the Osbourne family. When we look at the life of Ozzy Osbourne, most people focus on the wild chapters, the concerts, the controversies, the music, the reality show, the unpredictable behavior that made him one of the most iconic and yet misunderstood figures in rock history. But as his life moved toward its final weeks, the noise around him began to fade. In its place came a quietness that felt unfamiliar, even strange, for a man who had lived his entire life surrounded by volume, movement, and disruption. This quietness did not arrive suddenly. It arrived slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the loud world that Ozzy had given so much to was finally stepping away, giving him space to reflect on things he rarely spoke about openly. And this reflection, though uneventful to anyone on the outside, became the foundation for the emotional moment that would eventually lead to his heartbreaking final wish. In those last weeks, Ozzy found himself dealing with days that felt unusually long and nights that felt unusually short. His health had been a topic of concern for years, and the world had witnessed his struggles, physical, emotional, and psychological. But the intensity of public attention slowly decreased as newer stories took over the headlines. For the first time in a very long time, Ozzy's life felt like it was moving at a slower, almost monotonous pace. Sharon noticed this first. She had always been the one who watched him more closely than anyone else. From his early days of chaos and addiction, through his unpredictable career turns, to the quieter years when illness forced him to a different lifestyle, she was always the anchor, the observer, the protector. But in these final weeks, she began to notice something different, something softer in him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't expressive. It was simply a quiet change, like a dimming light that still shines but flickers in a way that reveals its exhaustion. Ozzy spent a lot of time sitting in silence, not deep thought, just silence. This was unusual for him. He was a man who always needed noise, guitars, television, people talking, laughter, arguments, anything but silence. Yet there he was, sitting with a stillness that felt strangely heavy. Sharon sometimes asked him if he needed anything, food, water, help with medication, or if he simply needed company. But he almost always responded the same way, with a slow shake of the head or a very soft "I'm fine." Inside these quiet moments, Ozzy wasn't trying to hide anything. He wasn't building suspense or preparing a dramatic revelation. If anything, he seemed to be letting go of all the unnecessary details of life. The more the days passed, the more he seemed to drift into simple thoughts, yet thoughts that held weight. One evening, while the house was dim and the air felt particularly still, Sharon walked into the living room and found Ozzy looking through old photographs. Not with excitement, not with sadness, just with a steady, slow expression that made it difficult to tell what he was feeling. His fingers moved over the edges of the photographs in a tired but almost intentional way. Sharon sat beside him, quietly. She didn't want to interrupt whatever was happening in his mind. She didn't even know if he was thinking anything specific at all. But she could feel something, a heaviness that she had learned to recognize after decades of living with him through moments that were far louder than this one. After several long minutes, Ozzy finally spoke. His voice was weak, but not in a dramatic way. It was simply the natural tone of a man whose strength had been slowly slipping away. He said, "These pictures, they feel like someone else's life." Sharon didn't respond immediately. She knew that Ozzy didn't always want comforting words. Sometimes he just wanted her presence. So she stayed silent, giving him the space he seemed to need. Ozzy then said something even quieter. "I don't know how it all went so fast." The words lingered in the air, not because they were poetic or emotional, but because they were true. And for the first time in a long while, Sharon felt the weight of how fragile everything had become. In the slow days that followed, Ozzy continued to drift toward this reflective state, He wasn't scared. He wasn't dramatic. If anything, he seemed resigned, like someone who had lived enough, fought enough, loved enough, and finally reached a point where he simply wanted peace. It was in this very atmosphere, a mix of slowness and emotional quietness, that Ozzy revealed his final wish. It didn't come suddenly. It didn't come during a dramatic breakdown or a tearful confession. Instead, it happened during another ordinary moment, one that Sharon would later describe as one of the simplest and yet most painful moments of their entire life together. It was a slow afternoon. Ozzy had been unusually tired that day, more than usual. Sharon helped him get settled, made sure he was comfortable, and then sat nearby just to be close to him. The room was silent except for the faint hum of a machine in the corner, one of the many medical devices that had slowly become part of their home environment. Ozzy's breathing was steady but shallow.
At one point, he opened his eyes and looked at Sharon, not with fear, but with a kind of softness she had rarely seen. It took him several seconds to speak, and the words came out slowly, almost fading between breaths. He said, "Sharon, I don't want any of this to be hard for you." Sharon blinked, confused. She didn't understand what he meant at first. She waited for him to continue. Ozzy continued, "When I'm gone, I just want things to be simple. No noise. No big thing. Just simple." Sharon held his hand tightly, feeling the weakness in his grip. He wasn't trying to make a dramatic final statement. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't even thinking about the public, his fans, or the legacy that everyone always talks about. He was thinking only of her. And then, in that same soft, slow voice, he said the words that became his final wish. "Just take me home. When it's time, take me home." At first, Sharon didn't understand the deeper meaning. But as he continued speaking slowly, haltingly, she realized the heartbreaking truth. Ozzy didn't want a public ceremony. He didn't want the crowds, the cameras, the tributes, or the world watching. After decades of being a public figure, he wanted his final moment to be private. He wanted his resting place to be somewhere that felt like home. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere that belonged only to the two of them, not the world. This wish was simple, but the simplicity made it even more painful. After a lifetime of fame, chaos, and noise, Ozzy Osbourne wanted peace. He wanted to return to the place that grounded him, the place he felt safe. And he wanted Sharon to carry that responsibility, not as his manager, not as his partner in the public eye, but as the woman who had walked with him through every painful, messy, complicated chapter of his life. Sharon listened without interrupting. She didn't cry at that moment. She didn't speak. She simply held his hand, letting her silence communicate the promise she was making to him. A promise she knew would break her heart when the time came, but one she was determined to honor no matter how difficult it would be. The days that followed moved even slower. Ozzy spent most of his time resting, drifting in and out of shallow sleep. Sharon stayed close to him almost constantly. The family visited, spoke softly, stayed gentle around him. And somewhere in that slow, emotional stillness, Sharon began preparing herself for the moment she knew she would eventually face. She didn't tell the public. She didn't make any announcements. This was something personal, something that belonged to them alone. And as Ozzy's final weeks unfolded with this quiet heaviness, his final wish became the silent truth that guided Sharon's thoughts every single day. Weeks later, when the inevitable moment finally came, Sharon felt a kind of pain she had never experienced before, but she also felt the weight of a promise she had to keep. As the days continued to unfold in that long, heavy silence surrounding Ozzy's final weeks, something strange began to happen inside the Osbourne household. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, and it wasn't anything the world would ever hear about through headlines or interviews. It was simply a slowing down of life itself. The house, once filled with noise, arguments, laughter, footsteps, clattering dishes, and the familiar sound of Ozzy humming or mumbling to himself became still in a way that made every passing hour feel longer than the last. Every morning, Sharon would wake up before him not because she needed extra time, but because she wanted to watch him for a moment. It wasn't dramatic, and she didn't cry while watching him. She simply observed the rise and fall of his chest, the way his breathing seemed softer than before, and the way his face looked calmer than she had seen in years. There was a peace around him that felt new, unusual, and almost uncomfortable because of how unfamiliar calmness felt in their long, turbulent life together. Ozzy no longer woke up at the same time every day. Some mornings he opened his eyes early, some mornings very late, and some mornings he barely opened them at all. But he always recognized Sharon. He always looked at her with a faint smile, small, tired, but genuine. And that smile carried a weight that said more than any words could express. Sharon knew he didn't have the energy for long conversations. She didn't expect him to talk. She simply stayed close, present in the same room, giving him the quiet company he had begun to rely on. There were days when Ozzy would reach out slowly, extending his hand just enough to touch her fingers. He didn't say anything when he did this. He didn't explain, but she understood. That small gesture was his way of saying, "I know you're here. I'm still here too." In the afternoons, the house grew even quieter. The sunlight came through the windows in slow, thin beams that stretched across the floor, touching the furniture in a way that made the room feel older than it was. Ozzy often sat in the same chair near the window, staring out without focus. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, not the sky, not the trees, not the distant figures walking on the street. He was simply looking, existing in the moment with no pressure to understand it. Sometimes Sharon joined him, sitting in the chair across from his. She didn't ask him if he was thinking about anything. She didn't break the silence. She had learned that these moments, though empty of conversation, were full of something more important: acceptance. A slow, steady acceptance of a reality that neither of them tried to fight anymore. Ozzy developed a habit of listening to very soft music during these quiet afternoons. Not the loud rock he was known for, not the heavy riffs or intense vocals, just soft, slow melodies that filled the background with a gentle hum. He rarely reacted to the music.
He didn't tap his fingers, didn't nod his head, didn't sing along, but he liked having it there, almost as if it reminded him of something he couldn't quite express. One evening, as the sky turned a dull shade of gray and the house lights turned on one by one, Ozzy finally spoke after hours of silence. His voice was low, slow, and almost fading into the quietness around them. He said, "It's strange how everything gets smaller at the end." Sharon looked at him, unsure what he meant, but unwilling to interrupt his thought. Ozzy continued, pausing between each phrase. "The world was so big, so loud, all the time. Now it feels small. Just this room. Just us." His voice drifted away after that, as if the effort of speaking had drained the little energy he had left. Sharon didn't respond with long sentences. She simply nodded and moved closer, sitting in the chair beside him instead of across from him. Ozzy rested his head slightly to the side and whispered, barely audible, "It's not a bad small. Just different." The next day moved even slower. Ozzy slept for most of it, waking only for a few brief moments. Sharon stayed beside him without complaint, without distraction, without frustration. She understood that these sleepy, quiet hours were part of the process, part of the soft decline that had entered his life. In one of his brief moments awake, Ozzy looked at her and said something that surprised her, not because of the words themselves, but because of how calm and steady he sounded. He said, "You've done enough for me, more than enough." Sharon didn't know how to respond. She felt her throat tighten, but she held back the emotion. She knew Ozzy wasn't being poetic. He wasn't trying to make her cry. He was simply stating something he had quietly realized during his slow reflection, something honest, heavy, and painfully simple. He added, I just don't want to be a burden now. The word burden stayed in Sharon's mind for the rest of the day. She knew Ozzy wasn't a burden. She had never seen him as one, even in his worst health moments. But she also knew that this was something he had carried in his heart quietly, without expressing it openly until now. Later that night, when the house was dark and the quietness felt deeper than usual, Ozzy called her softly. "Sharon, come here." She moved to his side, sitting on the edge of the bed. Ozzy spoke slowly, carefully choosing each word, even though he didn't seem to be thinking deeply about them. "I just want you to remember that I love this life, all of it, because you were in it." Sharon felt a tear escape her eye, but she quickly wiped it away. She didn't want him to see. She didn't want him to worry. Ozzy didn't notice his eyes were already half closed, drifting toward sleep again. The next morning, Ozzy didn't wake up on time. It took him several hours before he fully opened his eyes, and even then his body seemed heavier, his breath slower, his movements fewer.
Sharon stayed close, holding his hand gently, guiding his fingers between hers. In the middle of that long, slow day, Ozzy repeated the words he had said earlier in the week, almost as if reminding her was the only thing he still felt was important. "I want to go home when it's time." Sharon nodded, whispering softly, "I remember." Ozzy didn't reply, but she knew he heard. The world outside their house continued as normal, cars passing, people talking, news headlines changing, music playing, life moving forward with its usual speed. But inside the Osbourne home, time felt frozen. Every minute stretched into an hour. Every day felt like an entire week. The family visited more frequently during these final slow days. They didn't talk loudly. They didn't ask too many questions. They simply stayed near him, offering their presence the same way Sharon had been doing every day. Ozzy appreciated it, though he didn't express it verbally. Sometimes he opened his eyes for a few seconds when someone entered the room. Sometimes he blinked in acknowledgement. Sometimes he gave a faint smile. That was all. He didn't have the strength for more. And through all of this, Sharon carried the weight of his final wish like a quiet, invisible burden on her shoulders. She knew the day was approaching. She knew the moment would eventually come. And she knew she would have to honor the soft, heartbreaking request he had given her. "Take me home. When it's time, take me home." These words lingered in every silent corner of their house. They floated through the hallways. They echoed in the stillness of each night. And they became the center of Sharon's thoughts as she prepared for the inevitable. The last week before Ozzy's passing felt different from all the others, not louder, not more dramatic, just heavier. The air felt dense. The walls felt closer. The silence felt thicker. Everything around them seemed to slow down even more, as if the house itself understood what was coming. Ozzy slept through entire days at this point. Sharon rarely left his side. She slept on a chair beside the bed, waking up at every small sound he made. Even though he barely spoke, she still talked to him softly, describing small things from the day, even though she wasn't sure if he could hear her. Then, one evening, just a few days before the end, Ozzy opened his eyes wider than he had in weeks. Sharon was by his side instantly, holding his hand. He looked at her for a long moment, longer than lately, and whispered, with a voice that almost faded before it reached the air, "Don't let them make a show of me." Sharon understood immediately. This was the deeper meaning of his wish. He didn't want the world to turn his death into a spectacle. He wanted dignity. He wanted privacy. He wanted peace. Sharon nodded, unable to speak. Ozzy squeezed her hand gently, one of the last strong movements he would make. And after that, the quietness returned, heavier than ever.